you for tuning into our 4th episode of From the Cowboy State. I'm your host, Michaela Getz, and From the Cowboy State is a University of Wyoming Extension Agriculture and Natural Resources podcast. We've made it to our 4th episode, and it dawned on me that while all of the guest speakers we've had on the podcast have, given their credentials and shared how they've come to work with University of Wyoming Extension, I apologize, but I have not really done that for all of our listeners and subscribers. So I wanted to just share a little bit about myself / my background. I obtained my Bachelor of Science from Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri. I received my Bachelor of Science in Communications and Ethical Leadership. Immediately following that graduation, I moved to Texas, was there for almost 8 full years, and was working in grants and then later digital marketing. While I was there, I decided to enroll at Tarleton State University, where I received my Master of Science in Agriculture and Consumer Resources. And then immediately following my graduation there, that is where I received this role as your Agriculture and Natural Resources Educator for Park County, Wyoming. Loving being in Wyoming, and has been a phenomenal move for me. And here we are now. So without any further delay, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Jedidiah.
Thank you for the opportunity, Michaela. I grew up in Laramie, Wyoming, and participated in 4-H livestock and indoor exhibits when I was growing up. Worked on some cattle ranches in the area, and did my bachelor's degree at UW in ag business, and then went to UNL in Lincoln for ag econ, my master's degree, and worked around on a few different operations in Wyoming, Colorado, and Oregon, and most recently in Nebraska. And I transitioned from that job to Converse County when the position came open in February. So I've just been here a couple months, and I'm really happy to be in such a strong ag community.
Fantastic. So for those keeping track, that is, I believe, our 3rd UNL graduate who has been on the podcast. We won't hold it against you. No, just kidding. UNL is a great school. So Jedidiah, tell us a little bit, how did you mentioned that you were born and raised in Wyoming?
That's correct.
Correct.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about the operations that you were working on. Were those cattle operations, sheep, both?
There was at least one that did both.
Okay.
And pretty large scale on the sheep operation. So that was a good kind of balance to see. But other than that, been mostly cow-calf, one feedlot. So it's kind of been a good mix. It's been good to see different management styles and
absolutely
how people manage differently in different environments. Yep.
That's really neat. And I bet that gives you a really unique perspective as well, working with producers in this area as well.
Yes, there's a lot of sheep production in Converse County, a lot of range operations, and yeah.
Great. So, traditional question on the podcast. Since you do have this diverse background and everything, what does agriculture mean to you?
Agriculture is a very diverse industry. I think there's a lot of things that we gloss over when we think about agriculture. Obviously, beef production is huge. Sheep is kind of a strong second, but crops fall in there too.
Right.
Commercial grain production. We've got, fruit and nut orchards out in California that provide us with produce on a year-round basis. There's the cotton industry is huge for textiles, and even forestry, I think, falls under agriculture as well.
And we work with the Forest Service a lot as one of our many partners.
Yes, for sure. So agriculture it really involves everything from the coffee you drink in the morning to the ice cream you eat before you go to bed.
And the clothes we have on. Absolutely. And I apologize, I do just want to back up a little bit. How you came about to work in Extension. You have a unique connection to Extension.
Yes.
Your father works in Extension.
Yes.
And has for a long time.
Yes, my father, John Hewlett, has worked in extension for 30 years.
Yep.
And I grew up going to some programs with him, just seeing kind of on the peripheries how extension works. But it's been really neat to kind of step into a role in the system as well and be able to collaborate on a few things already. So.
That's great. And sorry, I'm just going to keep asking you a couple more questions on your background. Did you always want to work in extension where you worked on operations? Did you always see yourself stepping into an extension role?
No,
okay.
Actually.
Sure.
My plan going through my bachelor's degree was to graduate, get as much hand or book experience as I could, and then take a branch management position right out of college. And I attempted that, and it didn't work very well, so I was looking for options. And with the qualification of the master's, it was an easy fit to step into extension, and I'm really glad I did.
No, that makes absolute sense. I also didn't see myself working in extension. I knew I wanted to do something with agriculture, which I also, when I started my bachelor's, didn't know that was the field for me. I just liked agriculture, liked communications, hence the podcast, and was working started working actually in insurance when I started my full-time working career, moved to digital marketing, wasn't happy there, which who knew? And then just, kind of put two and two together. Agriculture makes me happy. Love that, I guess if you want to call that clientele, love the clientele, love being able to go out and work with producers and farmers and problem solve that way. And so getting my master's, taking those classes, it was just that natural fit. And extension was that. You do have your office, but your office is also someone's field, someone's cow-calf operation.
It's a classroom as well, right?
It is,
We're educators, so it's easy to communicate in a lot of ways about what we love.
It is, exactly. Okay, so hopping into today's podcast, we are going to talk about a few things and give some real-world examples. We're talking about grazing in drought conditions. And if you're in Wyoming, even if you're not, this is something we deal with all the time. So to get into that, we need to talk about a few other things first. And for those who don't already know who are listening, Wyoming's climate is technically considered semi-arid, even though we could argue it is arid, and continental, depending on where you are, your elevation and location. So this type of climate affects a lot of factors, but most of those are going to be your precipitation, temperature, and humidity. So for those of you who may not be aware, myself, Michaela, I am located in Park County. And so on average, we get 11 inches of rainfall. We are extremely dry up in the northwest corner of Wyoming. The U.S. average is 38 inches of rainfall. So most of our moisture is coming from that mountain snowfall runoff. And the county itself averages about 55 inches of snowfall. So Jedidiah is going to talk to us a little bit about Converse County and share some info there just to, again, give us some more perspective on that semi-arid continental conditions.
Yeah. So Converse County is a little bit lower elevation. Douglas sits around 4,900 feet, and we get about 12 inches of precip per year. Part of that is snow, part is rain, but it really comes in the shoulder seasons of spring and fall. Right now, we're sitting at about half of our annual precip, for 6 inches or so for the year. And in June, we had 3/4 of an inch over the whole month. And at the end, we were climbing into the 90s on some of those days. So, we could definitely use some rain if we could get it.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. So you said that you were at what was the elevation, sorry?
4,900 feet.
4,900. So Park County is, I think, 5,500, 56, give or take. So what are the technical conditions that have to take place to be considered under those drought conditions?
So generally, people would agree that precipitation is deficient during a drought. And so the Drought Monitor, U.S. Drought Monitor, has come up with kind of short and long-term kind of categories that the land can fall into. On the short-term side, it's generally less than 6 months where we would see less than average precip.
Sure.
And that's mainly going to affect the grasslands and croplands. But then on the long-term trajectory, it's going to be longer than that 6-month time frame, and you're going to see more effects in the hydrologic and ecological systems. So lower reservoir levels, lower groundwater levels, wetlands might be drier than usual, which kind of affects the whole biology of the system. So.
Right. Okay. Perfect. So to jump back a little bit, because you mentioned that drought scale and everything. So just, keeping it on layman's terms in general here, what is the drought scale that's used to measure those drought conditions? Just really getting into that nitty gritty there.
Yeah, so the U.S. Drought Monitor is based out of UNL. They use a scale of 1 to 4 to categorize drought.
Okay.
If it's assigned a 0, then that just means it's abnormally dry.
Okay.
But then from there, it moves into moderate, severe, extreme, and exceptional drought. So they use a combination of some precipitation and evapotranspiration indices to determine which areas fall under those categories. And it happens on a rolling basis. So this is a feed of big data coming in, and there's researchers working around the clock to kind of assess what's going on and evaluating whether those observations on the ground are true according to the model. And so about every 2 weeks they roll out a new map, and that can be found at droughtmonitor.unl.edu if people would like to sign up for the updates.
Perfect. That was going to be my question, how often they rolled that out, so that's great. I know you mentioned that Converse County specifically in June had 3/4 of an inch of rain. So that kind of leads me, and you guys had 90-degree temperatures. So that kind of leads me into my next question. Every couple weeks we're getting new information. What conditions are we currently sitting in?
So right now, about 58% of the state is abnormally dry.
Okay.
We've got 27% in that first moderate drought category and about 0.5% in a severe drought. And there's a combination of short and long-term effects kind of mixed in there. So depending on where you are, you may or may not see these effects. But the High Plains region, which includes Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, and Kansas, are sitting about similar as far as the percentages in each category, but it's a little bit more in the D1 and D2 categories.
You've shed light on these conditions that we're currently in and the scales used to measure these. But when you're constantly in these drought conditions within the climate that we've defined Wyoming has across the state, So, Jedidiah, you've talked about the different scales that are used for the climate conditions across Wyoming. But when you're commonly in these conditions, or when you're constantly in these drought conditions in this type of climate, what effects do these types of conditions have on the different elements that you have on your property, such as, your crops that you're growing, your garden, etc.? Can you discuss some of those factors or share some examples with us?
Yeah. So one thing that's really important is a lot of times, especially when we're under rainfall dependence, that drought can be very regional or location specific.
Sure.
So I was at a branding last week that was south of Douglas, and the pastures were a foot thick of crested wheatgrass and sweet clover. It looked amazing.
Right.
Yesterday I was in the northern part of the county, and it looked like grass had already gone dormant for the winter. It was so short and brown that it was that big of a change.
Right.
And so, yeah, it really depends on where you are and what water resources you have. But obviously, if you're going to be pulling stock water out of the ground, or if you're depending on reservoirs for stock water, drought's going to affect all those things. And so one thing I wanted to bring up was in every year, but especially during drought, it's especially important that we conserve water and try to increase that plant matter that's on the soil surface, just like a mulch in your garden, to kind of help keep as much water in the soil as possible and
Right.
help those grass plants out.
So, and this is going to be a little bit out of left field, if you will, but we have folks that are constantly moving to the state from Arizona, East Coast, West Coast, just all over, really. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes the mentality may be, we have a brand new garden, and they may know, or they may do their research. We have a brand new garden. Wyoming has a dry climate. Let's just plug it with water. Get as much water on there as possible. And that's not necessarily the wrong mentality, because you do need irrigation. But like you mentioned, you do also have to conserve water. So do you have some advice maybe for those first time, either it could be your first time doing an alfalfa field or planting a garden, just your first time homesteaders, I guess, if you will.
Mm-hmm. So there are a wide variety of soil moisture sensors that you can buy, and those can help you monitor soil moisture as you're watering. But another really easy indicator is to look at what the water's doing when you put it on the surface. Mm-hmm. If you're getting a lot of runoff or standing pools, you're probably irrigating too fast. And so one recommendation I found was, especially with regards to watering lawns, was you water for, say, a 20-minute period and then let it soak for 10 or 15 minutes.
Right.
And so you're not constantly running the sprinkler, but you are applying enough water that those plants can thrive, but reducing the amount of wastewater that's lost.
Absolutely. And there are water recycling systems, too, if needed, that you can implement. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Great.
Capturing rainwater is another easy way to kind of stretch your well, or if you're on the city, use less water. Yep.
That's great. So you recently wrote an article for Wyoming Livestock Roundup highlighting this topic exactly. And you provide a few examples, a few different options. And I think it would be a really great opportunity for you to walk us through those different options and the story example that you give in that article, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So I wrote it up as just kind of a typical scenario. A couple has 100 cow-calf pairs they're running. They're wanting to graze 4 months out of the year on just a native Wyoming rangeland that's kind of low to middle productivity. But under drought conditions, they're looking at about 25% reduction in their forage availability, and what their options are for meeting that deficit of forage. So the first option I run through is just to buy hay and feed through the drought as a really common one. A second option would be to reduce the forage demand by selling off some of the breeding herd. A third option would be to implement rotational grazing. There's many more options we could go through, but my goal with this paper was just to get people to consider what options there are and see where they can save some money, especially when forage is short, and that's a very valuable resource on a grazing operation. So.
Absolutely. And after reading through that, it seems like the first option, absolutely plausible, especially if you have both the funds, someone to provide you hay, and somewhere to store the hay. And plus, it's possible, you may already be hauling hauling/buying hay for other livestock on your property, and you could just simply increase, I say simply, not necessarily simple, but you could just increase your supply. So it would just be a matter of, do you have the ability to sustain that over X amount of time?
Right. And so in this scenario, they're only looking at feeding for 30 days.
Sure.
During the summer, the energy requirements of the cattle would be much lower than in the winter.
Right.
So if they already had those resources available, it's definitely an option. The trouble is, when cattle producers operate on such slim margins, adding another expense is always kind of a downer.
Right.
And so just to throw some numbers out there, I think they were looking at buying 36 ton of hay at $200 a ton, plus the cost of delivering it to the cattle. It was going to be around $75 a head, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if that $75 a head is the difference between your break even and losing money, it can be a definitely an important consideration.
Absolutely. And option 2, to me, it's you never want to have to get rid of your stock. So to me, option 2 seemed like you could argue the worst case scenario, and that has a question mark at the end of it.
Right. Yep. And there's a lot of different strategies people can use when they're selling livestock, especially in a cull situation. Mm-hmm. Obviously, early weaning is an easy one where you don't have to dig into those cows and bulls that you really value. If that isn't an option, maybe looking at culling the bottom 10% of your cows that really aren't performing that well anyway.
Right.
You can be kind of selective in that. It was really interesting that our livestock marketing specialist, Rob Ziegler, he contacted me with some data he pulled together looking at the seasonality of cull cow prices in Wyoming. And at least historically, the prices in August have been $11 to $20 per hundredweight higher in August than in January. So there might be some opportunity to catch some seasonality of the cattle market as well when you're thinking about culling or selling those breeding livestock, and maybe if you can work it right, buy them back cheaper than you sold them.
Absolutely. Okay, that's great. Then your third option discussed. Rotational grazing has its advantages. For sure, this is something, I was going to say this is a hot topic right now. It's a great topic across the board, period. But can you walk us through some rotational grazing and how to calculate one's range resources? Because I think this is something that people get hung up on, and we as extension agents get calls about quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to kind of define what I mean by rotational grazing.
Please.
First of all, to me, it just implies that you're not continuously grazing. There are some episodes during the season where you are allowing those livestock to graze, and then you are rotating them to a different area and letting those areas that were previously grazed recover.
And two, for our visual learners, if you have 100 acres and you divided your 100 acres out in 4 sets of 25, and you rotate those out in 25, 25, 25 patches, or even 50 and 50 patches. Mm-hmm. That's your rotational. You rotate from one to the next, to the next, to the next.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different variations on this.
Absolutely.
Like high intensity, you can do, some people go to multiple moves per day, which is like on the one end of the spectrum, and other people, you can put them on half the pasture for half your season and then the other half. It just depends on what works best. But the goal really is to graze in a moderated fashion so that as your different grasses respond based on their growth potential, the environmental factors like how much light and water is available, the temperature, It all plays into how the grass is able to recover, but the goal is just to set up the grass for the best recovery possible.
Right. And to not graze it down so that it's just stubs and bare and...
Right. Leaving leaves on the plant is the best way we can help grass, because that's the solar collector.
Exactly.
If you don't have any leaves left when you leave the pasture, they really are stunted in their ability to regrow.
Yeah.
And over time, they've done studies where the root mass actually declines under those scenarios, and it's not sustainable.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So rotational grazing really depends on a couple of factors to be successful. One is you have to have water access in all the pastures. That can be accomplished usually by putting a central watering point and doing kind of a wagon wheel approach to your fencing. If that's not possible, you might have to run some extra pipelines or run alleyways to get around some of these areas you've grazed and have so that the livestock can have access to water.
Right.
The general recommendations that came out of some UNL work is that water should be less than 1 mile from any given point in the pasture.
Okay.
Another thing that makes rotational grazing successful is to have really good control of your animal location. Usually people do this with, temporary electric fencing, and a lot of it can be, the infrastructure can be purchased for a few $100s, and then after that it's really just a matter of you putting in the time and management,
Sure.
having boots on the ground, but also doing those observational walks through your paddocks and making sure that everything's going good.
Right.
So a rule of thumb that's talked about a lot in grazing research is the take half, leave half rule. Whether that's determined by height or weight of the grass is hotly debated, but usually by weight is more accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're thinking about how much the livestock will graze, we want to take into consideration if there will be any other uses of that forage.
Okay.
So leaving half of the plant is a good thing. But if you take into consideration that wildlife are going to be eating that, insects, there's going to be some trampling, loss, those sorts of things, then you really can't take half with your livestock.
Right.
So a lot of more conservative levels generally shoot for 25 to 35% harvest efficiency on the cattle or whatever livestock you're grazing. And
so how then, or let me back up, is there a good way then to calculate your range resources or your range mass?
so what a lot of people do is put out exclosures at the beginning of the grazing season.
Okay.
So it's basically just like a 4 foot by 4 foot kind of hog wire cage staked into the ground so that you can get a full year's growth on that area, and then you go back at the end of the season, clip and weigh is a really validated.
That's the most traditional.
Right. It's very, very well validated in research. And then once you have that estimate, say it's 600 pounds per acre of forage, you can take your harvest efficiency, it's 25, 35%, and that's how much per acre your livestock will be able to graze in a sustainable fashion.
Okay, great. So we chatted about this a little bit, but I feel like maybe I see this a little bit more up in Park County than possibly here. I don't want to harp that in, but I feel like that's a fair statement. I feel like we can't discredit those that are caring for animals on small pastures. And by small pastures, I mean less than 50 acres.
Right.
How do you recommend folks that are caring for animals and horses, goats, sheep, chickens, etc., just animals in general? How do you recommend those folks dividing up their pasture for this rotational pattern that we just discussed?
So my number one thing I want to emphasize is we want to balance the capability of the land with the demands of the livestock.
Absolutely.
So you might have a pretty productive acreage, might be under irrigation.
Sure.
And so you can put more animals on those acres. But if you have a dry land spot that, is not very productive, grazing on those acres will be a much finer line to walk as far as how much the livestock will consume, and then balancing that rotation. You might just have to pull them into the corral and feed them for that period of time while you're waiting for the grass to regrow.
Right.
And depending on how much area you have to work with, like I said, getting water into all those paddocks might be kind of a challenge. So building an alleyway so that they can have access to the corral at all times might be how you get that accomplished. But overgrazing is the number one way to decrease the productivity on your land. So we want to avoid that if we can.
Absolutely. And we've mentioned Jedidiah's article in Wyoming Livestock Roundup. There are a lot of great resources in University of Wyoming Extension's publication, Barnyards and Backyards. Almost any topic that you could want to have covered for small acreage, whether it's supplemental feeds, getting your garden started, soil health, rotational grazing, etc. Don't hesitate to Google Barnyards and Backyards /UW Extension, and that publication or all of those publications and the website will pop up and you can view those online.
And another great resource people can access for a grazing calculator is the ranch tools that come out of UW Extension as well.
Absolutely. So, speaking of resources, what other resources do people need to consider under these discussed drought conditions?
Certainly anything to do with water is going to be affected by drought, so we're going to have to be very cognizant about well management if that's something you deal with. Livestock are going to need access to clean water at all times. Heat stress, obviously, in higher temperatures becomes a big concern. So mitigating that with shade, if possible, is really important. Some of our nitrate accumulators on the plant side will create a higher risk of nitrate poisoning in drought conditions because of the low water stress.
Right.
So these include corn, oat hay, sorghum Sudan. Those, if those are cut for hay, keep that in mind. Kochias and the Russian thistles, if those are grazed, those can accumulate nitrates as well. So if you have a concern, or if you have an area that is dominated by those plants, then you might want to get those tested before livestock graze those.
Absolutely.
Another thing to consider is a lot of our poisonous plants are forbs, and so if those green up sooner than the grasses at the beginning of the year because of low water access, then those might become a higher risk of being grazed because they are the most palatable thing out in the pasture at that time.
Yep.
Another thing is the wildfire risk is increased during drought conditions, so making sure we're very careful if we're building a branding fire, if we're welding outside, burning trash, any of those sorts of things, make sure we minimize the risk of igniting a fire if we can.
Absolutely. And to jump backwards just a little bit on the topic of, the nitrate accumulators and the poisonous plants, if you have questions, comments, concerns, if you're unsure what weeds / plants you see growing before what you planted, call your local extension office and or your local weed and pest office. We are all partners. We work together. Chances are everybody knows each other. So don't hesitate to reach out, contact either one of us, both of us, all of us, and we're all happy to help you. We will come out and take samples. We'll find out what's in your field / backyard, etc. And then as far as Jedidiah's comment on the wildfire risks, don't hesitate to reach out to your local forestry office. And if you're not on social media, they always post on social media the wildfire bans, but you can also call into that office and they'll let you know if there's a wildfire ban in effect. We talked about irrigation resources, but are there any other additions that you want to add there also, since we did touch on water?
Just on the water conservation side, drought is a great time to check your pipelines and ditches for any leaks that might have crept in. Checking your sprinkler heads to make sure you're getting adequate coverage, and just making sure you're not wasting water if possible is something to keep in mind.
Great. That was all phenomenal information. Thank you so much for your time, Jedidiah.
Absolutely.
Before we close out, you are here in Douglas, in Converse County. Are there any upcoming events, information, general things that you would like to share with us?
So there's a lot happening here in the next few weeks. The Central Wyoming Fair in Casper will be beginning the day after 4th of July. That'll be at the Casper Fairgrounds. Sheep and Wool Festival will be in Thermopolis, July 12th through the 14th in Thermopolis. Converse County Fair will be here in Douglas, July 13th through the 20th at the Wyoming State Fairgrounds. We've got at least 2 rodeos, a bronc riding event, and obviously the 4-H shows and exhibitions will be going on during that week. Wyoming State Fair will be in Douglas, August 10th through the 18th. And we also have farmer market season beginning.
Yes.
At the beginning of August, we'll have our first one, August 10th, at Jackalope Square in Douglas from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. And those will be continuing every Saturday through the 14th of September. Then over in our smaller community, Glen Rock, there will be the Sheep Herders Rendezvous, August 23rd through the 25th at the town park.
Well, just a few events then. That's fantastic, though. Thank you so much for your time again. Everybody, we will include Jedidiah's contact information, the article that he wrote, as well as a few other resources that were mentioned throughout the podcast today. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Michaela Getz. I am the University of Wyoming Extension Agriculture and Natural Resources Educator out of Park County, and I am your host for this podcast from the Cowboy State, and we were joined today by Jedidiah Hewlett out of Converse County in Douglas, Wyoming.
Thank you for the opportunity, Michaela.
Thank you all so much. As a reminder, this is the University of Wyoming Extension podcast. The university is committed to equal opportunity for all persons in all facets of the university's operations and is an equal opportunity / affirmative action employer. If you have any questions, comments, concerns about this statement, please don't hesitate to reach out to mgetz@uwyo.edu. and we can get your questions answered. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns about the podcast as well, again, don't hesitate to reach out to that email address, mgetz@uwyo.edu. Again, this has been a University of Wyoming Extension Agriculture and Natural Resources podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in.